Good.
All right. Today we're going to be thinking about tasks that purposefully connect pathways and professions in our PBLL projects. And this presentation is going to have 3 sections. The first is going to be a very brief review of the terminology to refresh your memory. The second will look at how the world of works provide guidance in developing authentic tasks for PBLL learners, and we'll have some examples. And the last section will then convert those examples into wording that you would use in the blueprint. So we want to provide you some guidance and examples of what some of that wording will look like in your blueprint. So we recall from Lesson 5, with CTE, we find something that is interdisciplinary, leverages learners' interests, is interactive, and provides opportunity to develop that interculturality. And it impacts the real world by doing real-world tasks and real-world problem solving. And all of these facets support the development of gold standard PBL. You'll remember we have our career clusters, and in each cluster there are several pathways, and each pathway leads to an infinite number of career possibilities. Then we have our knowledge and skill statements available at the cluster and pathway levels. Several of you mentioned in the discussion forum that you found this visual from the Minnesota Department of Education particularly helpful with its organization of those 16 clusters and 79 pathways. So I want you to think back over the past week and just pause for a moment to recall what connections you've now made between your PBLL project idea and those career clusters and pathways. I'm sure you were able to make a connection to at least one, if not 2 or 3 of the clusters. And now you might be wondering, and some even asked on the discussion forum, should I be connecting to multiple clusters? And the answer to that is yes. So connecting to multiple clusters is quite natural. In this section, we're going to think about how to leverage the learner's interests to engage in and strengthen the project design and design those authentic tasks. We're also going to consider how to accommodate various interests in the same classroom. When thinking about your PBLL project development, engaging the learner's interest is key. You may have identified a problem, process, product, and audience using your product square or project square. You've brainstormed what clusters and pathways potentially connect, and now you're thinking about how to engage the learners and what they will do and what they will produce. Really, one of the first things to be thinking about is which pathways are of interest to your students. There's some tools that you might have at your disposal to help you discover that so that you can strategically develop your project to tap those interests. So find out, does your institution have tools learners use to identify career areas of interest? Do they have career exploration plans? Check with your guidance or career planning office for tools that are already available to you and your learners, or perhaps for the data that you or they can pull about your learners. For the younger learners, you too actually might have tools that are already being used. When you design your project, you may be designing purposeful, specific connections to one or more pathways in order to provide experience and exposure to those pathways. As after all, very young learners have limited exposure to careers. So you're creating the opportunity to experience and explore as well as do what someone in that field would do at a developmentally appropriate level, of course. We'll have these career planning tools and others linked up in the resources section of your module. Whether you use a formal or informal tool, you could then use an organizer to group your learners into cluster groups of interest based on that career information, so that way you can see which of your students are interested in which area or areas. Conversely, if you're starting a project and you've identified certain career clusters or pathways pertinent to your project, you could ask learners to select particular career clusters or pathways to explore and work on in the project. Knowing where your learners' interests lie can help shape the PBLL project, its implementation, group the students for their work, and provide some motivation. One way to connect to careers and implicitly the clusters and pathways is to ask learners to put themselves into the role of a particular career with regard to a scenario you pose to them. For example, our town is considering building a new library, as the current library is a very small room in the local community center. The new library will be built on vacant land adjacent to the river that goes to the town. Now, what might the professions you see listed here say? What would they think about that? What questions might they ask about that project? Challenge students to create declarative statements as well as questions a person from the profession they represent might ask. Taking the perspective of a particular profession may provide insight and encourage exploration. Of course, this assumes the learners are familiar with the professions, and honestly, stereotypes might play into their responses. You too should be aware of your own biases as you choose careers to list for their consideration. Having learners take the perspective of someone in a particular profession would encourage students to consider the scenario from different points of view and develop empathy for others. We all know that putting oneself in another's shoes is a powerful experience. It can be an opportunity to move beyond stereotypes, expose students to professions they may not know much about. Could this even be done in the target language? Yes, but the language associated with what they produce may be at the novice level or more complex depending on the level of your classroom, your learner's experience, the scenario presented, the vocabulary they know, etc. I mentioned about potential bias, or perhaps you have to come up with a list of careers. The CTE documents can help you with that on the Advanced CTE website. On the web page for each cluster, there's a link to a document called the Career Cluster Frame. It's a PDF document. It's one page or sometimes two in some clusters, and it shows a chart with potential careers by pathway. So on the right, we see an excerpt from the Agriculture, Food, and Natural Resources career cluster. Do note that these are sample careers. It's not an exhaustive list, but it will give you some professions that perhaps you wouldn't have thought to put on a list of the sort we just saw. Another place to look for careers by clusters as well as other kinds of groupings is a place called ONET, and we'll have ONET linked for you in the module support materials. ONET's an occupational network database published by the U.S. Department of Labor. Elementary students won't find it thrilling. High school students barely find it thrilling, but it does have some interesting information in it, and it would be a place where you could see how careers can be organized in a variety of ways. So going back to the idea of learners having discussions either by cluster or by profession to get a perspective, they could work together to represent that cluster's opinion about a given scenario, so they wouldn't have to do it individually. You could provide simple discussion prompts to get their conversation started. You could also dig into the pathway and cluster standard statements to create some very specific conversation starters, and that actually can then scaffold some of the vocabulary for them. The conversation prompts could be specific to the scenario you put in front of them as well. So again, I also encourage the development of questions as well as statements. And it's hard for students to come up for questions. You may be surprised. So thinking about your project, let's just pause for a few seconds to think about how you might connect your project idea to students' interests. How are you going to find out what they're interested in, where their interests lie, or how might you organize how your project connects into their interests? When you have them talking with each other and you're gathering information, you also want to be thinking about the strategies they're going to use to and record out about their discussions and their interests, because that's going to give you some of the linguistic and cultural need-to-knows to help inform and develop the project. So let's imagine a scenario. Imagine we have a neighborhood experiencing a substantial immigrant population settling in the community. The community is interested in welcoming and engaging the newcomers. The question raised is, how can we create a welcoming community and invite our new immigrant families to become active members in our community? From a career perspective, you can imagine various occupations that may have contact with newly settled families. So what might the professions that are listed here say, think, or do to make a new family welcome and engaged in the community? What challenges can you see from the point of view of that professional? What questions might arise? Could your students process this problem from the point of view of a professional in the community? The project continues to develop through interviews with community members as well as recent and established immigrant families. Imagine how through those discussions, it became obvious that there was a need for orientation materials in the target language for the newly arrived families. School partners decide to create some products by children for children. In partnership with local organizations, students are going to create video and print materials that describe the town, the school, and what activities are available for children in the community, with the target audience being the children. So if we think about some connections to career pathways, one question is, what makes video and print materials appealing to young children and teens? Well, you can find some information about that in the Arts, AV, and Technology Communications cluster in the Visual Arts pathway, and it indicates that during the creation of products, a professional in this field will analyze how visual arts elements and principles of design communicate and express ideas. You can imagine customizing to young children as compared to teens. The CTE standard gives us ideas on what elements to consider, serving as a launching pad for the student work, as well as for discussions with professionals in the marketing or graphic design fields. While conducting the interviews with immigrant children and families, students discovered that there's an underlying distrust of the police, and this is coming from their target culture into their new culture. So they decide to also create a guide of useful phrases and cultural practices to help the local police understand the immigrant population and vice versa. The content of the guide connects to the law, public safety, corrections, and security pathway. The guide will include reference to the important skill of emergency responders to be able to use visual and vocal cues to interpret information received from body language, eye movement, voice tone, and voice inflection within the context of our immigrant population. Upon perusing the cluster statements for the kinds of tasks police officers do, we noticed the statement about public relation programs for fire and emergency management facilities to reach out to key audiences. And students began thinking about how emergency responders could convey information to the immigrant community about what they do, how they respond in an emergency situation, and how to communicate during an emergency situation. Further discussion determined that immigrant populations were a special audience that should have a targeted public relations program, perhaps extending beyond the phrase and cultural guidebook. So by looking through the standards, additional tasks related to our problem were identified and eventually developed into strategies. The development of that phrase guidebook for police does connect to the education and training pathway. Notice that Standard 2.1 focuses on appropriate text, and 3.1 on perspectives of multiple stakeholders. So in summary, the brief descriptions for this project connect to 3 clusters. The product is described by the Education and Training cluster within the context of the Law, Public Safety, Corrections, and Security pathway cluster, using techniques from the Arts, AV, Technology, and Communications cluster. So this is leading us into the third section of the presentation, that guidance for you on completing the project blueprint. If you've previewed the project blueprint, the structure of the statements you're seeing might be familiar to you. You may find that your project will tap more than one career cluster, and that's normal, that's okay. Perhaps one cluster will be more predominant in what tasks you have students do, and the other cluster is secondary or subservient to the first. Or you see in this example, we have the formatting about the content for the purpose of the product. So thinking again about how you're going to structure that statement that's requested in the project blueprint, on about page 5, you'll find a section on making those explicit connections. So let's look at a few more examples of how the language could be worded and connections made to tasks. A very simple scenario, the zoo is adding an animal. What animal should be added and how should the habitat be designed? So the connection would be, learners will explore the animal system's career pathway by analyzing the current animal distribution at the zoo and evaluating animal habitats to determine the animal's habitat needs for the proposed new animal addition. And you see the standards that those tasks refer over to. And then secondly, learners can explore the design pre-construction pathway by developing design criteria for building systems in the given scenario and employing the appropriate representational media to communicate those concepts and design. So determining the appropriate habitat needs is in the animal systems career pathway, and the design goes into the design and pre-construction pathway. And of course, in the real world, the zoo professional and the design architect will work together, and eventually the construction and transportation clusters will be brought into the picture as well. Your PBLL project will probably encompass multiple career connections. So part of your task is to identify those connections, take into account your learner's interest, decide where the focus of that PBLL project is going to be, what tasks will be engaging for students, and design the learning opportunities. So perhaps it's making children's materials that could fall into several potential connections. If you're looking at a social issue such as bullying or friendship, can fall into multiple connections. Micro-entrepreneurialism, going into the business, the marketing, the policy, the manufacturing. Perhaps you're going to take an investigation with a sister school or sister community. So what problems can you identify that could have really unlimited connections? So multiple connections to multiple pathways, it's absolutely fine. So now I hope you have a better understanding of potentially how to phrase those phrases for your project blueprint. And I hope that you found those statements particularly helpful. And so now you can turn your attention to thinking about which tasks can you purposefully base in those career clusters and pathways for inclusion in your blueprint and your PBL project development.